July 1943. The Kursk Bulge. It was not a battle, it was an execution. 30-ton steel monsters, the pride of the Soviet tank industry, were sliding helplessly in the mud like cows on ice. The crews knew, a stopped tank lives only until the first German shell hits. It was the end. Mud had defeated the army. But in a tent soaked with fuel oil, amidst the groans of wounded machines, an idea was born that defied common sense. An idea for which one could be stripped of rank and sent to a penal battalion. What forced the mechanics to work until they bled and had sand in their eyes? What secret ingredient turned clumsy targets into racing cars doing 40 kilometers per hour through impassable swamps? And why did the visiting inspectors call the salvation of the regiment criminal negligence? Learn the truth about Sergeant Sukhorikov's steel claws, which was never written in the parade ground history textbooks. July 1943. The Kursk Bulge. The sky, covered in leaden clouds, spewed torrents of water, turning the black earth into a greasy, impassable substance. Rain drummed on the armor, drowning out even the artillery cannonade on the horizon. 30 tons of alloy steel stood frozen in the middle of a soggy field. The engine roared, choking on diesel, but the machine did not move. The tracks spun madly in place, throwing up fountains of black mud that instantly plastered the observation devices. It was not a fight. It was an execution. The 500 horsepower of the V2 diesel engine were working in vain. Power capable of tearing down fortifications and toppling trees was now useless against simple physics. The coefficient of friction had dropped to a critical zero. Smooth factory tracks, designed for hard ground and highways, polished the Kursk black earth like skates on ice. The huge combat vehicle, the pride of the tank industry, had turned into a stationary, helpless target. Inside the tank, there was a smell of burnt oil, sweat, and animal fear. The cramped space of the fighting compartment vibrated from the strained howl of the transmission. The driver mechanic, gripping the levers with white-knuckled fingers, tried to rock the machine. "Back! Back it up, damn it!" rasped the tank commander into the throat microphone, clinging to the periscope. "No traction, Comrade Commander!" The mechanic's voice broke into a squeal. "It's like moving on butter! It's sliding, the bastard!" "Gun it! Give it a jerk!" The engine howled at maximum RPM. The tank's hull jerked, metal clanged, but the tracks only dug deeper into the yielding sludge. The tank was settling. The belly of the machine was slowly but surely lying down on the soil. This was a death sentence. If the tank bottomed out, only a tractor could pull it out, and there was no tractor here, nor would there be. Through the veil of rain and dirty streaks on the optics, the commander made out silhouettes. They moved slowly, confidently, heavily rolling over the hills. Tigers. The German machines, possessing wide tracks and better weight distribution, felt slightly more confident in this hell. But the main thing was that they were moving, and the T-34 was standing still. The distance was closing. 1,500 meters. 1,200. "They see us!" screamed the loader, dropping a shell onto the breach. "We are sitting ducks!" The situation fit into the dry, ruthless logic of war. A stationary tank on the battlefield lives until the first ranging shot. The crew knew this. The Germans knew this. It was not a duel of skill or armor. It was a firing squad. The physics of the process were murderously simple. Liquid mud clogged the depressions of the track links. Metal made contact not with solid ground, but with a layer of lubricant consisting of water and clay. The static friction force necessary for a push was absent. Every turn of the drive wheel only worsened the situation, creating a perfectly smooth, slippery bath under the track. Engineers in design bureaus, calculating specific ground pressure, relied on dry tables and proving ground tests. They had not seen this field, where the earth had turned into a swamp, greedily devouring machinery. A whistle was heard outside. The first shell fell short, throwing up a pillar of mud 20 meters from the left flank. Shrapnel clinked against the armor like hail. "They're zeroing in, the bastards!" The mechanic dropped the levers and covered his face with his hands. "Work!" barked the commander, kicking the back of the driver's seat. "Spin it while you're still alive!" But spinning was useless. The transmission howled, the friction clutches burned, filling the fighting compartment with acrid, suffocating smoke. The machine convulsed like a trapped beast, but did not move a single centimeter. The mud held it tight, more reliable than any trap. The second shell exploded closer. The shockwave rocked the 30-ton behemoth. Ringing in the ears drowned out the roar of the engine. The crew went deaf, but continued to act on reflexes. The loader shoved an armor-piercing shell into the barrel. The gunner feverishly spun the hand wheels, trying to catch the advancing silhouettes in the sight. But without maneuvering, without the ability to change position, their return fire was just a gesture of desperation. "Armor-piercing!" commanded the commander, although he understood. From such a distance, the frontal armor of a tiger could not be penetrated. They needed to get closer. They needed a flank attack. They needed speed. They had none of this. There was only black earth, which had become a deadly trap. The tank had turned into a steel coffin. Armor created to take a hit did not save them from tactical helplessness. Every crew member understood. The next German shell would be on target. They felt like hostages of an engineering miscalculation. A smooth track, an ideal plane for movement on a highway, which had become the cause of their inevitable death here, in a soggy Russian field. "Get out!" shouted the commander, realizing the machine was doomed. "Abandon tank! Take cover!" But it was too late. A flash on the horizon coincided with a monstrous blow to the frontal plate. The light faded. The tank shuddered, and a ringing silence fell inside, interrupted only by the hissing of punctured hydraulics and the groans of the wounded. The engine stalled. Outside, the rain continued to indifferently water the smoking steel. The mud had won. It turned out to be more terrible than German cannons, more treacherous than minefields. It deprived the weapon of its main advantage, mobility. And in this dirty, sticky silence, amidst the smell of burning and blood, it became clear. War is not just calibers and millimeters of armor. War is friction with reality, in the most literal, physical sense of the word. If you cannot push off the ground, you are dead. Field Repair Point number 5 was located in a hollow, sheltered from direct winds and, more importantly, from direct fire of German artillery. But there was nowhere to hide from the rain. Water was everywhere here. It squelched under boots, ran down collars, mixed with fuel oil and blood, turning the ground underfoot into a slippery mess, resembling grease in consistency. Senior Sergeant Ivan Sukhorokov stood near the evacuated T-34. The machine looked pitiful. It was not a proud predator, but a driven, beaten horse. The side was ripped open by a glancing blow, but that wasn't what killed it. The transmission killed it. The main friction clutch had burned to ashes trying to tear 30 tons of steel from the sticky captivity. Sukhorokov took off his mitten and ran his palm over the track. The metal was cold and slippery. Work boiled around them, heavy, monotonous, devoid of any romance. People in oily padded jackets, looking like shadows, tinkered at open engine compartments. The banging of hammers, the screech of files, choice profanity. the symphony of the repair battalion. They didn't shoot here. They resurrected, or wrote off. Sukhorokov knew he would return this tank to service by morning. He would replace the discs, rebuild the gearbox. But what was the point? He wiped his hand on a rag, leaving a greasy black streak on it. The meaning was slipping away. He could rebuild a V2 engine with his eyes closed. He could determine by ear which bearing was starting to sing. Behind his shoulders was Ural Vagonzavod, a school where they taught that the instruction manual is law, written in blood and by top-category engineers. There, in the workshops, technology was religion. Tolerance in hundredths of a millimeter, strict adherence to steel grades, tempering regimes. Everything was verified, calculated, approved. But here, near Kursk, factory truth shattered against the rough reality of the soil. "Burned the clutch again, Comrade Senior Sergeant." The voice of a young repairman, Private Petrov, sounded dull. The boy scraped clay stuck to the rollers with a crowbar. The clay did not yield. It stretched like rubber. "Fourth machine in 24 hours. Drivers say it doesn't drive. It swims, like a cow on ice." "Don't blabber," grunted Sukhorokov, but it stuck in his head. Cow on ice. He squatted, examining the track link. Cast steel. Smooth, with small protrusions that the designers called grousers. For the dry summer of 41, they were suitable. For the frozen ground near Moscow, they worked with difficulty, but they worked. But for this fatty, water-saturated black earth, which worked as an ideal lubricant, they were useless. The tread clogged instantly. The result was a perfectly flat surface. Steel on mud. The coefficient of friction approached zero. Sukhorokov lit a cigarette, shielding the flame with his palm. The smoke of pungent shag tobacco mixed with the smell of dampness. He closed his eyes, and for a second, disconnected from the hum of the repair zone. Memory is a strange instrument. It throws up the necessary blueprints at the most unexpected moment. In the darkness of closed eyelids, it wasn't the Ural Vagonzavod workshop that floated up, nor the blueprints of the designer Koshkin, but an old, soot-covered forge in the Urals. His father. He was about 10 years old. The winter was severe, -30 degrees. The river had frozen to the bottom, turning into a shining road. They needed to transport timber. Horses, mighty heavy drafts, stepped onto the ice and fell. Their legs splayed. The animals wheezed, beat their hooves, broke their legs. The helplessness of immense strength against a slippery surface. "Look, Vanka," his father boomed, taking a red-hot horseshoe out of the forge. "Strength isn't in muscles. Strength is in the grip. No grip, no traction." His father didn't read physics textbooks. He simply took a piece of sharp metal, a cork, and welded it onto the horseshoe. Crude, reliable, forever. "Winter shoes," he called it. When a horse shod in this way stepped onto the ice, the cork bit into the frozen water with a crunch. The pressure point decreased, pressure increased hundreds of times. Steel pierced the barrier, finding solid support, and the horse walked. It pulled sleds with logs that weighed more than itself. Sukhorokov opened his eyes. Before him was the tank track again. The same horseshoe, only weighing 1.5 tons, and the same problem, a smooth surface. A tank is the same horse, only iron. It lacks claws. It has nothing to hook on to this cursed earth with. He stood up, walked right up to the track link. He ran his finger along the groove. Mud immediately filled the trace. "Petrov," he called. "Here, Comrade Senior Sergeant. If we install new friction clutches now, how long will they last?" The private shrugged, smearing mud on his face. "Until the first ravine. If the rain doesn't stop, they'll stay there. Mechanics throttle to the limit to get out. The discs burn in 5 minutes. Correct. They burn, because there is no traction. All the power of the engine goes into heat and squealing. Efficiency is 0. Ivan walked away from the tank and headed towards a pile of scrap metal dumped at the edge of the ravine. It was a sad burial mound of war. Twisted pieces of armor, scraps of cables, bent beams of destroyed village huts. The repair battalion used this as donor material. Sukharukov kicked a rusty channel bar. Too wide, won't do. The mechanic's gaze scanned the pile of iron, not as trash, but as a catalog of spare parts. He needed something simple, something that could be found in any destroyed cowshed or at a bombed railway station. Something that had a stiffening rib, an acute angle. He saw it. Sticking out from under a pile of broken bricks was a piece of steel angle iron. Ordinary, equal leg, 40 by 40 millimeters, structural steel. Soft compared to armor, but viscous. Sukharukov pulled it out, weighed it in his hand. About 3 kilograms. Rusty, crooked, but the geometry of the profile was preserved. If one were to weld such an angle to the track, not flat, but on the edge, or like a tent, create an artificial protrusion. Build a claw. Comrade Sergeant, what are you looking for there? Petrov came closer, looking with curiosity at the piece of iron in the commander's hands. I'm looking for a solution, Petrov. A solution. Sukharukov returned to the tank. He applied the angle iron to the track link. It lay perfectly across the link. The height of the shelf was 40 millimeters. This was enough to punch through the layer of liquid mud and reach firmer ground, or simply create such resistance to shear that the track would cease to be a ski. Look, Ivan pressed the angle to the dirty metal. If we weld this to every 5th link, no, every 10th, every other one takes too long, to every 10th link, what will happen? Petrov frowned, trying to imagine. It'll stick out. Won't it catch on the fenders? We'll check. There is a gap there. The main thing is how to weld. The cast iron of the link and the steel of the angle. Different metals. It might fall off on impact. We need good electrodes, the private noted, getting into the mind game. If we could get UONI ones, but we only have chalk ones left, damp. We'll dry them. We'll dry them on the exhaust pipe of the tractor. Sukharukov felt the fatigue receding. Excitement appeared. Not the kind in battle, when adrenaline hits the temples from fear, but the cold, calculating excitement of an engineer who has found the right path. He remembered the factory instructions, the clause about the prohibition of making changes to the design of the undercarriage. It is categorically forbidden to weld on foreign elements that violate balancing and kinematics. To hell with balancing. The dead don't need balancing. Listen to my command. Sukharukov's voice grew stronger, acquired metallic notes, drowning out the noise of the rain. Take the cutter. Go to that pile. Cut me some angles. Length, the width of the track, so they don't stick out over the edges. Cut about 10 for the start. Comrade Senior Sergeant, what will the company commander say? That's damage to property. They'll court-martial us if we tear the track. Ivan looked at the darkening horizon, where flashes of night battle were beginning to flare up again. There, in the mud, crews were dying right now. Dying because they couldn't move. There will be a court-martial if we send tanks to the slaughter. Sukharukov cut him off. And if they drive, winners aren't judged. Cut, Petrov. I'm getting the welding machine. He stepped toward the mobile workshop. A technological map was already building in his head. Clean the welding spot to a shine. Warm up the metal so there is no thermal shock.
Apply the seam in 2 passes. Place the angle at an angle to the plane of motion so that the mud is squeezed out to the sides. It was a simple, crude idea, primitive as a hammer blow. But it is precisely such ideas that win wars, when complex technology fails before nature.
The blacksmith father knew this, shoeing horses. The mechanic's son remembered this, saving tanks. The rain intensified, turning into a solid wall of water, but Sukhurikov no longer noticed it. In his imagination, the tank was no longer standing. It was tearing the ground with steel claws, throwing clumps of earth backward and moving forward. Inevitably. Night descended on the Kursk bulge, a night that promised to be long and very bright from the light of the welding arc. Ivan Sukhurikov held in his hands a piece of rusty metal that was supposed to change the course of the battle. It was an ordinary equal leg angle, a standard profile of structural rolled steel, 40 by 40 millimeters, shelf thickness, 4 millimeters. In civilian life, frames for greenhouses or warehouse shelves were welded from such things. Here, amidst the Kursk mud, this piece of cheap steel weighed more than gold. He turned it in his hands, applying it to a spare track link lying on the workbench. The geometry matched perfectly. The width of the T-34 track allowed the angle to be welded across without touching either the idler or the drive wheel during rotation. But the devil, as always, is in the installation details. If welded flat, there would be little use. The mud would simply flow around the obstacle. If placed vertically, on the knife, it would be torn off by the first stone or impact on frozen ground under the mud. The weld seam wouldn't withstand such sheer load. The solution came through understanding the vector of forces. Angle of attack. 45 degrees, whispered Sukhurikov, running his finger along the dirty cast iron of the track. Place it like a tent? No, by the shelf. We weld one shelf to the plane of the track. The second works as a ridge. He took chalk and drew a thick white line on the rust of the angle iron. Then he scratched on the track link. The scheme was emerging simple and rigid. The angle needed to be welded not with a continuous seam, which would overheat the track steel and make it brittle, but with a discontinuous but powerful fillet. And the main thing, placement. The angle must stand so that when the track presses on the ground, it works like a plow, biting into the viscous substance and reaching a solid base. "Petrov," the sergeant barked without turning around. "Bring the gas cutter. We're going to cut." The sound of hissing acetylene cut through the noise of the rain. The blue flame of the cutter bit into the metal, spraying drops of molten steel. Sukhurikov cut quickly, without marking, by eye, which over years of factory work had become more precise than calipers. Pieces of angle iron fell into the mud, hissing and releasing steam. The length of the workpiece, 300 millimeters, exactly along the working surface of the track. At that moment, the flap of the tent serving as a canopy was thrown back abruptly. Cold wind and the commander of the repair company, Captain Voronov, burst inside. His raincoat glistened with water. His face was gray from lack of sleep and anger. "Sukhurikov, what is this amateur activity?" The captain stepped over a puddle of oil and loomed over the workbench. "I gave you an order to prepare transmissions. And what are you busy with? Chopping up scrap metal?" Ivan turned off the torch. The flame went out with a sharp pop. Silence fell, in which only the captain's heavy breathing and the drumming of rain on the canvas were audible. "This isn't scrap metal, comrade captain. These are grousers." "What the hell kind of grousers?" Voronov kicked a still smoking scrap of angle iron. "Are you out of your mind, Sergeant? You have 3 machines with burnt clutches. The battalion commander is tearing and throwing, demanding vehicles on the move. And you've set up an arts and crafts circle here?" Clutches burn because the tracks slip, Sukhurikov answered calmly, looking straight into the officer's eyes. His gaze was heavy, factory-hardened, the gaze of a man who knows he is right. We can change gearboxes every hour. It won't help. The tanks won't drive. They will stand and burn the clutch until the Germans burn them. The captain took off his cap, ran his hand through his wet hair. He understood this. Everyone understood. But he had regulations, he had orders, and he had responsibility. Do you understand what you are proposing? Voronov's voice became quieter but harder. You want to weld structural steel to high manganese track steel. Do you know what will happen? Thermal tempering. The link will crack at the first load. The track will break in battle. The crew will die. And you, Sukhurikov, and I, along with you, will be sent to a court-martial for sabotage. This is damage to state property. It won't crack if welded wisely, Ivan parried. We need quality electrodes. Current 250 amperes. We weld with short tacks, let it cool. Hadfield track. The steel is finicky, but if you don't overheat the heat-affected zone, it will hold. If, the captain paced nervously around the cramped tent. Do you have an approved blueprint? Do you have permission from the regiment's chief engineer? I have physics, comrade captain, and I have 2 hours until dawn. Sukhurikov picked up the cooled piece of angle iron and applied it to the track link. Look, shelf height 40 millimeters. The support area of the edge, next to nothing, a couple of square centimeters. The pressure at this point will be colossal. The tank weighs 30 tons. Divide the weight by the area of these edges. We get pressure in hundreds of atmospheres. This angle will slice through any mud like a knife through butter and hook onto the solid continent. The tank will go. Voronov looked at the rusty piece of iron pressed against the dirty track. There was something barbaric, crude, anti-scientific about it. Factory instructions were written in clean offices by people in white coats. They calculated the undercarriage life for 5,000 kilometers. But here, in the hell of the Kursk bulge, life was measured in minutes of battle. And if the angle tears off? Asked the captain, not so confidently anymore. It'll fly like shrapnel. If it tears off, then it tears off. We'll put on a new one. But the tank will move. An immobile tank is just a pile of iron, comrade captain. A tank with angles is a combat unit. Voronov was silent for a long minute. He looked at the exhausted mechanics, at Sukhurikov, who stood before him with a torch in one hand and a piece of steel in the other. The captain knew he was risking his shoulder straps, and his head, for changing the design of a combat vehicle without sanction from above in wartime. People were shot for less. But he also remembered the T-34s burning in the field, unable to turn their frontal armor to the enemy because their tracks were grinding mud. How much time do you need for one machine? He asked hollowly. If you give me 4 welders and electrodes, we'll do a company overnight. 10 machines. A company? Voronov shook his head. You're bold, Sukhurikov. If even one track breaks at the weld... I'll sit in the first machine myself, the sergeant interrupted him. In the driver's seat. If it breaks, I'll stay there. The captain waved his hand, as if shooing away a delusion. All right, do it. But officially, I didn't permit anything. It's your risk, Sergeant. And your responsibility. Take the electrodes in the 3rd box. There's pre-war stock. UONI 13. Don't you dare ruin the tracks. Voronov turned and walked out into the rain, leaving behind a trail of anxiety and unspoken hope. Sukhurikov exhaled. His hands were trembling slightly, not from fear but from the tension of the moment. Permission received, even if unspoken, on the verge of a foul. Now the real work began. Did you hear? Ivan turned to the frozen mechanics. Petrov, run for the electrodes. Sidorov, fire up the second post. Vasya, you're on cutting angles. No measurements needed. Chop by the sample. He lit the torch again. Now there were no doubts in his actions. The plan was simple as a point-blank shot. Take a standard track link, take a standard angle iron, and with the help of an electric arc and some motherly language, join them into a single hole. Turn a smooth ski into a toothed instrument of war. Sukhorokov took the first angle, cleaned the contact area with a wire brush to a steel shine. Dirt and scale flew to the sides. He knew what he was doing. This wasn't just welding. This was surgery. He was going to transplant new organs of movement onto the tank. Organs not foreseen by designers, but vitally necessary here and now. Sparks from the first touch of the electrode sprayed in all directions, illuminating the sergeant's determined face. The temperature in the arc column jumped to 6,000 degrees. The metal flowed. Sukhorokov began to run the seam, even, scaled, reliable. Steel to steel. Stubbornness to stubbornness. In this night filled with the rumble of distant cannonade, in a small canvas tent, an invention was being born. Without a patent, without blueprints, without scientific justifications, born of desperation, ingenuity, and a piece of rusty 40 by 40 profile. An invention whose price was life. The night over the repair base was torn to pieces. It wasn't artillery. It was an electric arc. 10 welding posts switched on simultaneously, sagging the voltage of the field generators. The diesel engines of the power stations roared strenuously, spewing clouds of black exhaust into the wet air. Tank number 207 stood first in line. A huge carcass, immobilized with disassembled tracks. The ribbons of tracks were spread on the ground, resembling the spines of prehistoric lizards. The mud had already been knocked off them, the metal cleaned to a grey, matte shine. Now the sacrament of connection began. Senior Sergeant Ivan Sukhorokov lowered his shield. The world disappeared, swallowed by the blackness of the mask. Only the point of contact remained. He struck the electrode against the steel. A flash. A blindingly white spot, in the center of which the very essence of war melted. The temperature in the welding zone reached 6,000 degrees. The steel angle, pressed by a clamp to the track link, heated to a cherry glow.
Sukhorokov guided the electrode smoothly, describing crescents with the tip.
He needed to fuse the viscous, soft steel of the profile with the finicky, hard manganese casting of the link. It was a metallurgical misalliance. Hold the arc a little too long, you overheat the link, and it becomes brittle as glass. It will crack from a sledgehammer blow. Hurry a little, you get lack of fusion, and the angle will fly off at the first turn. "Current! Add current!" Ivan yelled without raising his mask. His voice drowned in the crackle of discharges. The assistant darted to the rheostat of the welding machine, twisted the knob. The arc sang more angrily, harder. The metal flowed more obediently, laying in even, dense scales of the seam. The smell was unbearable. Burnt paint, scale, acrid smoke of electrode coating, and ozone that tickled the throat. There was no ventilation. The canvas of the tent held this chemical cocktail inside, making people cough and rub their watering eyes.
Sukhorokov worked like an automaton.
Flash, seam, the knock of a hammer chipping off slag. Inspection, move to the next link. Flash. Hands began to go numb. The vibration of the holder, the weight of the cable, the static pose, all this accumulated, turning muscles into stone. But stopping was impossible.
For one tank, 144 angles had to be welded, 72 on each track. And that was only if welding on every link. They decided to weld every fifth. Even so, it came out to about 30 angles per machine. 30 seams, each of which had to be flawless. "Electrode!" A hand in a canvas mitten reached into the blind zone. Petrov immediately put a new rod into the holder. The stub flew into the mud, hissing like a snake. Time lost meaning. Only rhythm remained. Burn an electrode, 3 minutes. Change, 5 seconds. Cleaning, 1 minute. This conveyor ground down people's strength faster than millstones grind grain.
20th ready! Someone shouted from the darkness of the neighboring post.
"Don't rush," Sukhorokov responded, not interrupting the arc. "Chip the slag, check the pores. If there's a fistula in the seam, cut it the hell off and re-weld." He feared defects. A defect here meant not a reprimand, but the death of the crew. If an angle tears off and gets between the roller and the balance arm at a speed of 40 kilometers per hour, it can jam the track. The tank will turn its side to the enemy. The end. Therefore, Ivan inspected every seam personally when he raised his mask to gulp the stale air. His eyes burned. Even through the dark glass of the filter, ultraviolet light reached the retina. By morning, everyone would have sand in their eyes, an occupational disease of welders when it is impossible to look at light. But that would be later. Now, eyes were just an optical instrument guiding the hand. By 3 in the morning, the pace began to drop. People were tired. Movements became sluggish, irritable. One of the mechanics dropped a sledgehammer on his foot, swore filthily, and sat in the mud, clutching his knee. "Get up!" Sukhorokov's voice sounded dry, like the crack of a breaking branch. "Don't sit. If you sit, you'll fall asleep."
"Ivan Dmitrievich, no strength,"
the boy wheezed.
"Hands won't hold. The electrode is dancing."
"Tie it."
"What?"
"Tie your hand to the holder with a rag if your fingers won't hold. And weld. The tankers won't sleep tomorrow, and neither will you." Sukhorokov himself could barely stand on his feet. His back burned with fire. His neck was so stiff that he had to turn his head with his whole body. He felt sweat flowing down his back in cold streams, mixing with the dirt on his body. The padded jacket was soaked with metal fumes, becoming heavy and stiff as a shell. Tank number 207 was almost ready. Its tracks, recently smooth and helpless, now bristled with rows of steel teeth. Crude, angular growths, welded to death, changed the very appearance of the machine. It became predatory, aggressive. Ivan finished the last seam on the left ribbon. The electrode stub fell out of the holder. He raised his mask. His face was black with soot, white circles around his eyes from goggles, like a raccoon. He looked at his work. The seam was even, with a smooth transition from the angle to the body of the link. Fillet, 8 millimeters. No undercuts, no cavities. The temper color on the metal spoke of the correct temperature regime. "Assembly!" he commanded, spitting black saliva. "Tighten the tracks!" Mechanics, staggering, dragged the cables. The clank of metal on metal sounded in the night like music. Heavy tracks, now weighted down by another 3 kilograms each, reluctantly crawled onto the drive wheels. Pins were driven in with sledgehammers, forcing them into the eyes with a dull, dense sound. Captain Voronov looked into the tent again.
He hadn't slept that night, rushing between headquarters and the repair base.
"How are things, Sukhorokov?" 207 is ready. 209, finishing the left side. 212, in process. You have an hour until dawn. At 0500, machines must be standing on warm-up. Germans might attack with the first rays. We'll make it. Sukhorokov walked to the water tank, scooped up cloudy liquid with a mug, drank it in one gulp. The water tasted of iron. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. A fine, nasty tremor of overexertion. He clenched his fist, trying to calm the shaking. The fist did not obey. "Petrov," he called, "bring the next batch of angles. Comrade Senior Sergeant, you should take a break. I'll finish welding myself." "Weld," Ivan nodded. "But I'll stand nearby. Control." He couldn't leave. Didn't have the right. This night wasn't just a shift. It was a marathon for survival. Where the finishing tape is not a metal, but the sound of a running engine and the clank of tracks biting into the earth. The welding arc flashed again, snatching from the darkness the tired faces of people and the predatory profile of the modernized track. 58 minutes remained until dawn. 58 minutes of fire, smoke, and molten steel. The morning of the 5th of July, 1943, arrived without sun. Dawn merely marked the boundary between the black sky and the gray earth. The rain stopped, but it had done its job. The proving ground chosen for testing was an ideal trap, a soggy lowland where mud reached a man's knee. It was the very substance that stopped armies, thick, sticky, sucking off boots with a smacking sound. Tank T-34, with side number 207, stood at the starting position. Outwardly, it differed in no way from hundreds of other machines, except for one nuance. Fresh, rough growths blackened on its tracks. The weld seams hadn't even had time to rust. Steel angles, welded at an angle, stuck out like spikes on brass knuckles. People gathered around, mechanics dropping from fatigue, company commander Captain Voronov, several tankers. Tension and skepticism could be read in their poses. They knew the physics of this field too well. They had seen tractors settle on their bellies here. The idea that pieces of construction profile could change the laws of friction seemed, to put it mildly, naive. Inside the machine, in the driver-mechanic's seat, sat Senior Sergeant Sukhorokov. He kept his word. This was his risk and his exam. He adjusted the seat, checked the levers. Hands that trembled from overexertion an hour ago now lay firmly on the controls. The ether crackled in the headset. 207, ready to start? Voronov's voice sounded dry. Ready, Ivan answered. Task. Pass in a straight line 100 meters. Turn 180, return. If you get stuck, we won't pull you out. Nothing to pull with. Sukhorokov pressed the starter button. Compressed air hit the cylinders, followed by diesel. The 12-cylinder V2 diesel coughed blue smoke and roared, reaching operating RPM. Vibration went through the hull, echoing in the spine. It was the heartbeat of a beast ready to pounce. Ivan depressed the main friction clutch, engaged second gear. Usually in such mud, they started in first, crawling, afraid to send the tracks into a spin. But now, the theory had to be tested for strength. Sink or swim. He smoothly released the pedal and gave it gas. Usually at this moment, the following happened. The engine gained RPMs, the tracks began to spin madly, digging a pit under themselves, and the tank slowly settled. But today, physics malfunctioned. Or rather, it began working in a new way. The tank jerked, sharply, roughly, as if kicked from behind. Sukhorokov's head snapped back, hitting the headrest.
The tracks did not slip. The steel angles cutting into the soft sludge worked like the blades of a paddle wheel. They punched through the upper slippery layer and found purchase in the depths. Mud, which previously clogged the tread, now flew out from under the tracks in huge clumps, thrown back 5 meters. The machine lunged forward. "We have contact!" someone shouted outside. But Ivan didn't hear it. He saw only the narrow slit of the periscope and the rapidly approaching bushes. The speedometer came to life. The needle, which in such conditions usually trembled around the 5 km/h mark, confidently crawled to the right. 10, 15, 20. Sukhorokov shifted to third. The gearbox clanked but caught the gear. The engine howled in bass, feeling the load but coping with it. The tank went through the swamp like a cutter through water. Didn't crawl, didn't slip. It flew. 30 km/h. 40.
42, Ivan shouted to himself, not believing his eyes. 42, mother! This was the speed of a good truck on a highway. Here, in the mud hell, it seemed like teleportation. 30 tons of steel were rushing off-road, spraying mud in a fan, creating a black trail behind them. Ahead was a turn, the most dangerous moment. On slippery ground, a tank attempting to turn usually continued moving straight by inertia, going into an uncontrolled skid. The tracks lost lateral grip. Sukhorokov yanked the left lever toward himself. The machine obeyed instantly. The left track locked, biting into the earth with the angles. The right one continued to paddle. The tank was thrown to the side, the hull listed, but it entered the turn. It entered in a clear arc, without drift, without skidding. The angles held the lateral vector of force, working like the crampons of mountaineers on ice. Ivan felt centrifugal force pressing him into the side of the cabin. It was a forgotten feeling. The feeling of complete control over the machine. He was no longer a passenger in an uncontrollable box. He was a pilot. The 180-degree turn went just as cleanly. The tank turned practically on the spot, throwing a fountain of black earth 2 meters high from under the tracks. Sukhorokov straightened the machine and gave full throttle on the way back. Stupor reigned at the observation point. Captain Voronov forgot about his binoculars. He looked at the roaring machine rushing toward them, growing in size. "Look at what he's doing," whispered an elderly mechanic standing nearby. "Moving like on asphalt." "It's not asphalt," Voronov answered, not taking his eyes off. "That, Petrovich, is sound engineering." The tank braked 10 meters from the group, dipping its nose. Inertia faded, and the machine froze, shrouded in steam and the smell of hot oil. The engine went to idle, purring evenly. The driver-mechanic's hatch swung open. Ivan Sukhorokov climbed out onto the armor. His face was splattered with mud, but his eyes burned with a feverish shine. He jumped to the ground. His feet sank ankle-deep into the sludge, but the tank stood on this sludge confidently. Mechanics ran up to it. They looked not at him, but at the tracks. "Clean!" Petrov shouted, running his hand over a link. "Look, guys! Self-cleaning!" Indeed, the angles worked to eject. Mud didn't stick between them. It was squeezed out by pressure. The tracks were wet, dirty, but the relief remained functional. Voronov approached slowly. He walked around the tank, looked at the deep, clear tracks left by the machine. These were not the smeared ruts of slipping machinery. These were teeth marks. Deep, ragged wounds in the earth, showing with what force the metal pushed off the ground. "What was the speed on the straight section?" the captain asked. 42 km/h by the gauge, Comrade Captain, Sukhorokov reported. "Drop to 20 on the turn. Handling, 100%. Braking distance, normal." Voronov shook his head. He still couldn't wrap his mind around what he had seen. In one night, with the help of a welding machine and a pile of scrap metal, they had turned a clumsy target into a racing car. 5 kilometers was the limit yesterday, the captain said quietly. 5 against 42. 8 times. Do you understand, Sergeant, what you've done? You increased tactical mobility by almost an order of magnitude. I just added traction, Ivan shrugged, wiping his hands on a rag. Physics, comrade captain. The friction force changed sign. Now it works for us, not against us. A crowd had already gathered around the tank. The rumor about the flying tank spread through the repair base instantly. Tankers from other crews felt the angles, argued, cursed with delight. "All right, clear the way," barked Voronov, regaining his command tone. Suhorakov, here. Assemble the brigades, all free posts, to welding. Mobilize everyone who knows how to hold a holder. Open the emergency reserve warehouse. Issue all electrodes. The captain looked at his watch. We have a regiment standing. By evening, the entire tank regiment must be reshod. If one machine moves like this, imagine what 100 such machines will do when they go into the breakthrough. The Germans expect us to crawl, but we will fly. Voronov smiled for the first time in 24 hours. The smile was predatory, mean. Act, Ivan. Now it's not an experiment. It's a combat mission. Start the conveyor. Suhorakov nodded. Fatigue piled on again, but now it was a different fatigue. The pleasant heaviness of duty fulfilled. He looked at his tank. Dirty, predatory, toothed. It was ready for battle. The mud, which just yesterday was a curse, had become their ally. Because Russian tanks learned to walk on it without asking permission from the weather. "Petrov!" shouted Ivan, shouting over the noise of the crowd. "Bring the cutter! No end of work to do!" The morning of July 5th finally came into its own. And although the sky was still grey, on the earth, amidst mud and iron, a new era of maneuver warfare began. The era of the steel angle iron. The command order arrived at 1200 hours. It was brief as a shot and heavy as a tombstone. Equip the entire tank regiment with grousers. Deadline, 24 hours. Captain Voronov put down the field telephone receiver and looked at Suhorakov. Silence hung in the dugout, in which, it seemed, one could hear hair turning grey. The entire regiment. That's 40 combat vehicles. If counting the minimum, 30 angles per tank, that's 1,200 steel profiles. That's almost 400 linear meters of rolled steel. That's hundreds of kilograms of electrodes. And that's hellish, inhuman labor of people who hadn't slept for 2 days. "Can we handle it?" asked the captain, although there was no question in his voice. There was only an order. "No metal," Ivan answered, looking at the map. "About 10 meters of angle left in the repair battalion warehouse. That's for one machine. We used the rest at night." "Search." Voronov poked a finger at the map, where the ruins of a bombed railway station blackened 3 kilometers away. There were warehouses there. There were sheds. Germans smashed everything to rubble, but metal doesn't burn. Take a truck, take men with cutters. Get me that steel from underground. 15 minutes later, a truck, engine roaring, was already churning mud on the road to the station. 5 soldiers with gas cylinders bounced in the back. Suhorakov sat in the cab, gripping the door handle. He looked not at the road, but at the destroyed skeletons of buildings flashing in the veil of rain. His gaze now worked like a scanner, tuned to one frequency: iron. The station met them with the smell of burning, and the silence that only happens in a cemetery. Piles of broken brick, twisted rails, craters filled with cloudy water. "Spread out!" commanded Ivan, jumping out of the cab. "Look for angle iron, channel bars, I-beams, anything that has a right angle. Shelf thickness, not less than 4 millimeters. Don't take rebar. It's round, awkward to weld, won't give traction." People wandered through the ruins. They were involuntary looters, vultures of war seeking not gold,
but rusty structural steel. "Sergeant, over here!" shouted one of the soldiers, standing on a pile of debris of what used to be a repair depot. Sukhorokov climbed up. Under the blockage of concrete slabs, beams were visible. Powerful steel trusses welded from angles. Klondike. "Cut!" Ivan waved his hand. "Right here. Drag the cylinders here." "There was a mortar shelling here half an hour ago, Comrade Sergeant," the soldier said doubtfully, looking at fresh craters.
The place is zeroed in.
"Cut, I said!" "We don't have long to live anyway. We need to work." Acetylene hissed. Blue tongues of flame bit into the structures of the collapsed building. The metal yielded reluctantly. It was stressed under the weight of concrete. When the cutter burned through the first beam, it sprang back with a hollow ringing, nearly striking the cutter operator. Sparks rained down on wet bricks, hissing in puddles. They worked under the open sky, ignoring the whistle of stray shells falling somewhere behind the forest belt. It was ore mining in a death zone. Every meter of extracted angle iron cost the risk of being covered by a salvo. But they cut. Loaded hot scraps with sharp edges into the back of the truck. Hands in canvas mittens slipped. Metal burned even through fabric, but the truck bed filled up. When they returned to the location, the conveyor was already being deployed at the repair base.
Sukhorokov, barely climbing out of the truck, immediately took control.
Here, amidst clang and cursing, he was the conductor of this iron orchestra.
"Listen to the task!"
His voice, torn by shouting, rasped but drowned out the noise of engines.
"Organize a flow. First group, cutting to size. Second, cleaning. Third, welding. Feed machines one by one. Done, gone. Next one in."
It was the Ford system, transferred to the mud of the front line zone. No superfluous movements. Each soldier did only one operation. One only cut the profile into pieces of 30 centimeters. Another only cleaned the welding spot on the track. A third only tacked the angle. A fourth welded completely. The logistics of the process were built rigidly. Angles, still warm after gas cutting, flew to the cleaners. From there, to the tanks. Welding cables snaked along the ground, intertwining in a complex pattern. Cable shortage was solved simply, twisting pieces together, insulating with rags. Current losses were monstrous. Machines overheated, but the arc burned. Sukhorokov walked along the line, checking quality. "Chip off the slag!" he yelled at a young welder who, in a hurry, forgot to go over the seam with a hammer.
"Who are you welding for? Fritz? Leave slag. Corrosion starts. Seam cracks. Redo it."
"Ivan Dmitrievich, electrodes running out," Petrov reported, running up with an empty box.
"To the quartermasters. Shake everyone down. Ask the signalmen, the engineers, everything that burns and melts. Here."
People worked like wound-up mechanisms. Faces turned black from soot, eyes inflamed from constant flashes of the arc, but no one left. Mechanics understood. There, on the front line, crews were waiting for these tanks like salvation. Every welded angle was a chance to survive. It meant an extra 5 kilometers of speed. It meant a maneuver that would lead away from an armor-piercing shell. By night, the pace reached the limit. People began to fall. Literally.
A welder at the third post simply slumped to the ground, dropping the holder.
Sukhorokov ran up, splashed water from a flask onto his face.
"Alive?"
"Alive." The boy barely opened his eyelids. "Eyes hurt. No strength. The picture is swimming."
"Get up, brother. Must. There's a bucket of chefir over there. Take a sip, and back to work. We don't have the right to sleep."
The tea was black, thick as tar. It accelerated the blood, forced the heart to beat at the limit, squeezing the last reserves out of the organism. It was fuel for people, just as necessary as diesel for engines. The war of the rear is no less cruel than the war of the front. Here there are no direct attacks, but there is an exhausting, monotonous struggle with entropy and chaos. That night, the repair battalion ground through tons of metal. Destroyed beams found in ruins turned into weapons. Old structural steel found new life, becoming part of combat vehicles. By 3 in the morning, the site resembled a factory floor during crunch time. Dozens of welding arcs flashed simultaneously, creating a stroboscopic effect. Shadows danced on the armor of tanks. The smell of ozone mixed with the smell of sweat and tobacco. Sukhorakov himself stood in for the dropout soldier. He welded mechanically, turning off emotions, turning off fatigue. His world narrowed to a spot of light through the mask glass, a pool of molten metal, movement of the electrode, short circuit, metal transfer, crystallization. "Next!" he shouted, raising the mask. A tank drove off with a roar. A new one took its place. The conveyor didn't stop for a minute. By dawn, when gray gloom covered the proving ground again, the work was finished. 40 tanks stood in a row. Their tracks predatorily bristled with fresh welds. This was no longer just equipment. It was a modernized armada, adapted to conditions considered impassable. Captain Voronov walked along the formation.
He looked 10 years older after that night, but satisfaction shone in his eyes. "Report, Senior Sergeant." Sukhorakov straightened with difficulty. His back wouldn't unbend. His hands, black from ingrained scale, hung like whips. "Regiment reshod, Comrade Captain. Material consumption, 1,500 angles. Defects eliminated on the spot. Machines ready for battle." Voronov handed him a cigarette case. "Smoke, Ivan. You accomplished the impossible. Engineers in Moscow will rack their brains over how we did this in 24 hours without factory equipment." "Let them rack." Sukhorakov took a drag, feeling the nicotine hit his head. "It's warm there in the offices, but we have to fight here." He looked at the column of tanks. They stood quietly, menacing, heavy. But now he knew. These behemoths wouldn't get stuck. They would pass where the devil would get stuck. Because into every track link was put not just a piece of iron, but the will of people who cut beams under fire and welded until they lost consciousness. Logistics won. The repair battalion won its battle, the battle for traction, for speed, for life. Now the word was with the tankers. The morning of the attack began not with artillery preparation, but with deceptive silence. German positions on the heights beyond the Seversky Donets floodplain dozed in the confidence of absolute safety. Before them lay a kilometer of swampy, lowland meadow soaked by rains. For the Wehrmacht's tank wedges, accustomed to the hard roads of Europe, this was an insurmountable obstacle. German engineers, pedants, and pragmatists marked this sector on maps as tank-inaccessible terrain. Minefields were rarely placed here. Nature itself was the best minefield. In the periscopes of German observers lay only a dirty plain glistening with water. They knew. Any tank daring to poke its nose here would turn into an immobile pile of metal in 50 meters. And an immobile tank for an .88 caliber anti-tank gun is just a practice target. But at 600 hours, the physics of war changed. The sound of the growing roar of dozens of V2 engines forced German officers to tear themselves away from coffee pots. The roar was strained, angry, but even. It wasn't the sound of slipping machinery when the engine screams at the limit while the tracks stand still. It was the sound of gaining speed. Silhouettes burst out of the morning fog swirling over the lowland. The T-34s were coming not in a wedge, not in a chain, but in an avalanche. And they were coming fast. "Tanks!" yelled the observer, losing his voice. "Tanks in Sector Swamp!"
German artillerymen rushed to the panoramic sights. The gunner of the first gun habitually spun the handwheel, taking a lead. His brain, trained by years of war, automatically produced the solution to the problem of shooting at a moving target. A tank on wet ground implies a speed of 5, maximum 7 kilometers per hour. Lead, half a hull. Shot. The shell threw up a fountain of mud far behind the leading machine. The gunner froze. He couldn't have missed by that much. It was impossible. The tank was moving at a speed of 35 kilometers per hour. Smooth outlines of turrets sliced the air, and below, under the belly, the very battle of engineering that Sergeant Sukhotukov had won was taking place. Welded angles bit into the fatty black earth. Every turn of the drive wheel pressed steel edges into the soft flesh of the earth, creating a rigid pivot point. The mud didn't have time to work as a lubricant. It flew out from under the tracks like shrapnel, thrown back meters. Inside the lead machine, the battalion commander yelled into the throat microphone, drowning out the din. "Hold formation! Don't slow down! Gun it, damn you, gun it!" The driver mechanic, clutching the levers, felt the machine like never before. Usually in such mud, the tank swam, nosing around, not obeying the helm. Now it went firmly, as if on rails. The vibration was monstrous. Angles beat against the ground, transmitting shocks to the hull, shaking the soul out of the crew. But this was the vibration of movement, not the agony of getting stuck. "Going like on asphalt!" shouted the driver, baring his teeth in a mad smile. His face was splattered with oil flying from the transmission. "Comrade Battalion Commander, they hold! The angles hold!" "I see," responded the commander, clinging to the sight. "Fire on the move!" A tank gun shot on the move is a lottery. But now the distance was closing so rapidly that it was hard to miss. Soviet machines flew through the dead zone of the swamp in a minute and a half. The time the Germans allotted for shooting stuck equipment compressed to an instant. Panic reigned in the German ether. Radio intelligence interceptors heard hysterical screams. "They aren't stopping! Target speed extreme! Sight ruined! They are breaking through the floodplain!" German defense was built on time calculation. Artillery was supposed to cut off infantry. Anti-tank guns knock out equipment while it crawled through the mud, but the time factor was destroyed by welding. Tanks burst onto solid ground in front of the German trenches without losing a single machine in the swamp. The element of surprise was absolute. It wasn't the tactical genius of generals drawing arrows on a map. It was a triumph of applied mechanics. The lead T-34 flew onto the parapet of a German trench with a running start. A blow of the belly on the ground, screeching of metal. Tracks with welded spikes ground up the machine gun nest along with the crew. Grouses created to cling to the earth now tore the wood of fortifications and barbed wire, winding it onto the rollers. "Left 20! Anti-tank!" shouted the commander. The tank lunged left, sharply, without a skid. The weld on the tracks dug into the soil, providing instant response to the maneuver. A German shell, fired at the spot where the tank should have been by the logic of inertia, passed by, bathing the armor in hot air. "Miss!" exhaled the loader, shoving a fragmentation shell into the breach. Here, in close combat, the advantage in maneuverability was worth the thickness of the armor. Tigers standing in ambush on the flanks didn't have time to turn their turrets. Soviet tanks spun like tops, changing attack vectors, using the fact that their tracks didn't slip. Sukhotukov was in his machine in the second wave at this time. He didn't shoot. His task was to listen and watch. He listened not to the ether, but to the sounds of the undercarriage. The clank of tracks was different, harder, ringing. But they didn't break. Weld seams made in the night under rain held the monstrous loads of impacts and torque. He saw Lieutenant Petrov's tank ahead execute a sharp turn. dodging a head-on collision with a Ferdinand self-propelled gun. An ordinary track in such a turn on mud would have broken loose. The tank would have spun broadside to the shot. But Petrov's machine, throwing up fountains of earth, fit into the arc and went into the German's rear. Shot point blank. Explosion of the self-propelled gun's ammo rack. The turret of the German monster flew aside. "It works," whispered Sukhorokov, wiping sweat from his forehead. "It works, damn it!" The battlefield turned into chaos, but in this chaos, Soviet tankers had a decisive advantage: traction. They dictated the tempo. They chose the distance. They imposed their will on an enemy who expected an easy duck hunt, but got a fight with a furious pack of wolves. The regiment's radio ether was filled not with cries for help, but with angry, reckless commands. "Third, flank right. The ground is soft there, you'll pass." "Roger, going, have grip." "Fifth, crush the gun. Don't fear the ravine, it'll pull out." The ravine, which just yesterday would have been a grave for a tank, today became a tactical trick. Machine number 212 dove into a deep washout, hiding from fire, and immediately, engine roaring, flew out the other side, right into the flank of a German battery. The angles, like mountaineer claws, pulled 30 tons of weight up a slippery slope with a steepness of 30 degrees. By noon, the defense on the heights was breached. German units, knocked from positions, retreated, abandoning heavy weapons. They lost not because they had fewer tanks or worse guns. They lost because their calculations collided with a variable that wasn't in their equations. This variable was called Russian ingenuity, multiplied by steel angle iron 40 by 40. When the battle began to subside, and tanks stopped to refuel at captured lines, the regiment commander approached Sukhorokov's machine. He jumped off a Willys, walked up to the tank track from which steam was rising. Clumps of grass, wire, and German uniforms hung on the tracks. The angles were polished to a mirror shine by friction against the earth, bent in places, but all were in place. Not a single seam had cracked. The colonel took off his glove and touched the hot metal of the weld. "Well then, innovator," he said, looking at Sukhorokov climbing out of the hatch. "Germans in the ether are screaming about devil tanks flying through the swamp, asking if we're on an air cushion." "On the steel one, comrade colonel," Ivan answered, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. "On ordinary steel." "I'll recommend a decoration," the colonel threw out briefly. "Both you and your whole gang of welders." "But the medal isn't the main thing, Sergeant. The main thing is that over there." He nodded toward the field, strewn with burning German equipment. "Today we passed where it was impossible to pass, and that is worth more than any gold. Check the rollers, Sergeant. Forward again in an hour. Rain is starting." Ivan looked at the sky. Clouds were covering the horizon again, promising a new downpour. But now this rain caused no fear. Mud was no longer an enemy. It was just a surface they had learned to defeat. The silence that fell after the breakthrough turned out to be deceptive. Barely had the gun barrels cooled and the dust settled when a new enemy appeared at the tank regiment's positions. He arrived not on tracks, but on wheels, in a clean, mud-free Willys. It was the Frontline Technical Commission. Engineer inspectors, people with clipboards, calipers, and authority capable of sending one to a court-martial faster than the special department. The war with physics was over. The war with paper began. Senior Sergeant Sukhorokov was summoned to the commander's tent. 3 men were already standing near tank number 207. 2 officers in perfectly fitted tunics and 1 civilian specialist in glasses with thick lenses, a representative of the People's Commissariat of the tank industry. They looked at the tank tracks not with admiration,
like the infantry, but with the squeamishness of prosecutors examining a burglary tool. "What is this?" The engineer major leading the commission poked a finger at a welded angle. His finger was clean, with a neat nail, which contrasted sharply with the oily hands of the mechanics around. "Additional grouser, Comrade Major," answered Sokolokov, snapping to attention. "Grouser?" The major smirked, but his eyes remained cold.
This, Sergeant, is called sabotage. This is called unauthorized modification of the undercarriage design approved by state standard. Do you know what you have done? He turned to Captain Voronov, who stood nearby, gloomy as a storm cloud. "Captain, do you realize that you have violated the kinematics of movement? You increased the weight of the track belt. You created an imbalance that destroys the bearings of the idler and drive wheel. But the worst thing is the welding." The civilian specialist stepped forward, took a magnifying glass from his pocket, and squatted near the track link. "Track steel grade, 35G13L, Hadfield steel," he began in a lecturing tone, as if he were in an institute auditorium, not a field near Kursk. "High manganese austenitic steel. It is not intended for welding with ordinary structural ST3 steel, from which your angles are made. When heated above 300 degrees, carbides precipitate in the heat-affected zone.
The metal becomes brittle. He raised his head, looking up at Sokolokov. "You have turned the tracks into glass, young man. Upon impact with a stone, this track should shatter. The fact that you drove here is pure chance. The luck of fools." Sokolokov was silent. A dull, heavy anger was boiling inside him. It was the anger of a practitioner who had pulled the regiment out of the swamp with his own hands, directed at a man who saw a tank only on blueprints and proving grounds, with hard surfaces. "Permission to speak." Ivan's voice sounded hollow. "Try to justify yourself. Hadfield steel is indeed finicky, but we welded with short seams, staggered, avoiding overheating the base. We used UONI 13 electrodes, giving a plastic seam. Not a single link cracked. We went through 20 kilometers of battle, Comrade Engineer. Through ravines, through craters." "Didn't crack is for now," the major cut him off. "Metal fatigue accumulates. Microcracks are already there. You reduced the life of the undercarriage from 2,000 kilometers to, God willing, to 100. Who gave you the right to dispose of state property? A tank costs 200,000 rubles. You ruined 40 machines. That's 8 million in losses." There it was, the logic of the rear. Arithmetic of rubles against arithmetic of life. The major saw in the tank a material value, an inventory number, a resource in engine hours. Sokolokov saw in the tank the only shell separating the crew from death. "If we hadn't welded the angles," Ivan said quietly, looking straight into the major's glasses, "these tanks would have stayed in that lowland, and German tigers would have burned them for free. Their resource would have been 0 kilometers. "Don't teach me tactics, Sergeant," the major flared up. "Your business is to turn nuts according to instructions. There is a manual on field repair. Clause 42. Welding any elements to tracks is prohibited." "Have you read the manual?" "I have." "So you violated it intentionally. Captain Voronov, write an explanation. I am drawing up an act on criminal negligence and damage to entrusted equipment. Materials will go to the court-martial. Tracks for replacement. Cut off the angles immediately." Voronov clenched his fists so hard his knuckles turned white. The order to cut off angles meant disarming the regiment in the face of the muddy season. It was suicide, certified by a stamp. At that moment, the tent flap opened, and the regiment commander came out. The colonel was without a cap, in an unbuttoned padded jacket with a bandaged arm. He had heard the conversation. "Major." The colonel's voice was quiet, but all the more terrifying for it. "Let's step aside." The commission and the commander walked over to a staff table set up right on shell crates. The colonel threw a sheet of paper on the table. "Read." "What is this?" The major squeamishly picked up the sheet, covered in pencil writing. "Summary of losses for today's battle." The engineer scanned the lines. "So?" "Equipment losses, 0. Personnel losses, 3 wounded. Destroyed enemy, 5 tanks, 2 self-propelled guns, 3 batteries, up to a battalion of infantry. Bridgehead captured." The colonel lit a cigarette, blowing a stream of smoke into the commission's face. "And now listen to me, engineers. My neighbor on the left, the 121st Regiment, went into the attack without angles, strictly according to instructions. Do you know where they are now? Burning in the river floodplain. Lost 15 machines in an hour. Crews shot up like in a shooting gallery. They observed your precious undercarriage resource. They saved metal. Only they have nothing left to fight with. And no one." The major fell silent. The argument was murderous. Statistics are a stubborn thing, even more stubborn than regulations. "You talk about microcracks," the colonel continued, looming over the table. "About metal fatigue. A tank in war lives on average 3 attacks. 3. If it lives 5, it's already a hero. I don't give a damn what happens to the tracks in 1,000 kilometers. It matters to me that the tank passes 100 meters here and now. Sergeant Sukhorokov gave us those 100 meters." The civilian specialist took off his glasses and wiped them with a handkerchief. Something resembling confusion appeared in his eyes. The theory of strength of materials collided with the practice of resistance to the enemy. "But there are rules," he muttered uncertainly. "If everyone starts welding whatever they want." "Rules are written for standard conditions," the colonel interrupted harshly. "Kursk mud is a non-standard condition. It's force majeure, and the sergeant's solution is the only thing that worked. You can write your acts. You can send me to court-martial, but I won't let the angles be cut off, and I won't let my people be hurt." He turned to Sukhorokov. "Ivan, go work. Check the seams. If cracks really started somewhere, re-weld." The major stood red, puffed up with indignation, but he had nothing to object. Before him was not just paper, but the living truth of war, a truth measured not in millimeters of tolerance, but in the number of funeral letters that would not be sent home today. The commission left an hour later. They drew up an act in which, using complex wording, they pointed to a forced measure in conditions of heavy operational situation. The bureaucratic machine creaked but turned, yielding to the pressure of trench logic. Sukhorokov watched the departing Willies. He felt emptiness. This battle was harder than the night shift with a welding machine. There he fought with metal, which was honest. Here he fought with people who hid behind paragraphs of instructions. "Don't take it to heart, Vanya," Captain Voronov approached him. "They do their job, we do ours. Their task is to save equipment for the parade. Ours is to burn it for victory. Different tasks, different tolerances." Ivan nodded. He walked to the track of his tank. The weld seam over which the scandal flared was in place. It had darkened slightly from heating while driving, but held tight. A thin strip of metal connecting factory science and field ingenuity. "Court-martial cancelled?" asked Petrov, looking out from behind the turret. "Cancelled," Sukhorokov smirked. "But quality needs checking. Bring a hammer. We'll look for those damn microcracks." He turned back into a mechanic. Politics and bureaucracy remained somewhere back there, in headquarters. And here remained the task. Prepare the machines for tomorrow. Because the war hadn't ended, and the mud hadn't gone anywhere.
And as long as it exists, the laws of physics will be more important than laws written on paper.
August 1943 brought with it dry, dusty heat, replacing endless rains. The Battle of the Kursk Bulge was ending, transitioning into the phase of strategic offensive. The roar of guns shifted to the west, leaving behind scorched earth and staff tents where other work was going on. Quiet paperwork, but no less terrible. The arithmetic of war was underway. In the front headquarters, debits were reconciled with credits. Only instead of rubles and kopecks, here they counted barrels and souls. Clerks, exhausted by insomnia, clicked abacus beads, tallying loss totals. Usually, these reports were a funeral march. A tank regiment in the active phase of an offensive burned out in 3 or 4 days. This was the norm. A terrible statistic of human material expenditure approved by regulations.
But the summary for the 145th Tank Regiment stood out from the general picture like a gold nugget from a pile of waste rock. The Chief of Staff wiped his glasses several times, thinking the clerk had made a mistake in the zeros. The survivability of machines turned out to be 2.5 times higher than average. This was not just a number. Behind the dry coefficient of 2.5 stood a physical anomaly. Tanks that should have remained black skeletons in the mud of the Seversky Donets returned to service. They were slashed by shrapnel, with bent fenders, with smashed optics, but they were alive. And, more importantly, their crews were alive. 340 people. Ivan Sukhorukov sat on the armor of his T-34, parked at the edge of the forest, and smoked. He didn't see the staff summaries. He didn't need paper confirmations. He saw the result with his own eyes right in front of him.
A long column of combat vehicles stretched along the clearing. Diesels cooled, emitting a characteristic metallic ticking. Crews climbed out onto the grass, took off helmets, exposing sweaty, filthy faces to the light wind. If not for Sukhorokov's stubbornness, if not for that night watch with the welding machine, this column wouldn't exist. Instead of living guys, only new marching companies sent to replace the dead would be standing here now. A driver mechanic from a neighboring machine, a young sergeant with a bandaged head, approached the tank. He silently sat next to Ivan, took out a tobacco pouch. "Saw that Ferdinand yesterday at the crossing?" he asked, not looking at his interlocutor. "Saw it," Ivan nodded. "Big beast." He held me in his sights. I saw in the periscope how his barrel turned toward me. Direct fire, 400 meters. I thought then, that's it, finished driving.
Pedal to the metal, and there's clay like butter.
The sergeant took a drag, blowing smoke through his nose. An ordinary track would have spun out there. A second of delay and goodbye family. But those angles of yours, they hooked. I even felt the machine jerk. A jerk, and I went into the ravine. The shell went high, only sliced the antenna. He turned to Ivan. In his eyes, circled by black rings of fatigue, there was no pathos. There was only a calm realization of a miracle. Turns out I'm alive because of a piece of iron, because of a piece of rusty profile worth 3 kopecks. Strange thing, war. Sukhorukov remained silent. He had nothing to answer. He was thinking about the same thing. The price of life in war often depends not on heroism, but on trifles. On an extra cartridge, on a sip of water, on the timely noticed glint of optics. And, as it turned out, on the coefficient of friction. 340 people. That is 3 full-blooded companies.
That is 340 letters that mothers will receive, not in official envelopes with a death notice, but as triangles with the words, alive, healthy, beating, Fritz.
Ivan jumped off the armor and walked to the track. He squatted, touching the welded angle with his hand. The metal was worn, edges blunted from impacts against stones and concrete, but the weld held. This primitive prosthesis, roughly sewn onto the perfect body of the tank, turned out to be the most effective weapon. It granted maneuver. Meanwhile, at headquarters, they continued to analyze the phenomenon. Officers of the operations department drew diagrams. They superimposed the terrain map on movement charts. The conclusion was unequivocal. The regiment won not by fire, but by dynamics. "Look here," the colonel poked a pencil at the map. "Germans covered squares where tanks were supposed to get stuck, but ours passed these zones at a speed of 40 kilometers per hour. Enemy artillery hit empty space. We outpaced their death by 2 minutes. 2 minutes in a tank battle is an eternity. In 2 minutes, you can reload a cannon 10 times. You can go a kilometer. You can live a whole life." Sukhorokov didn't know the high mathematics of probabilities. He knew the arithmetic of labor. To save those 340 lives, it took 1,500 angles, 200 kilograms of electrodes, 48 hours of continuous welding, and burnt retinas of 10 repairmen. The exchange rate was favorable. Damn favorable. In the evening, a field kitchen pulled up to the bivouac. The smell of buckwheat porridge with stewed meat overpowered the smell of diesel. Laughter, ringing of mess tins, someone's harmonica, sounds of a living camp. Ivan looked at this picture and felt the spring coiled into a tight knot, all these days unwinding inside. "Hey, Ivanovich!" the commander of the 2nd platoon shouted to him. "Come join us! We have alcohol, captured stuff."
"We'll drink to your welding."
"I don't drink," Sukhorokov waved his hand. "Eyes hurt." "Then eat some porridge, or the wind will blow you away." He approached the fire. People stepped aside, clapped him on the shoulder. No one said loud words about a savior. Here it wasn't customary. Gratitude was expressed in the fact that he was handed the fullest mess tin, into which the cook generously plopped an extra ladle of meat. "Eat, Sergeant," said the old cook. "You need strength. They say the division commander ordered the experience to be spread to the whole division. You'll have work. Can't shovel it all." Sukhorokov smirked. Work is good. Work is life. As long as the repair battalion welds, tanks drive. As long as tanks drive, infantry is alive. This simple chain of dependencies was clearer to him than any ideological doctrines. He ate porridge sitting on a shell crate and looked at a rusty angle iron lying in the grass. A scrap left after assembly. A small piece of steel. A symbol of the victory of reason over chaos. History textbooks will write about the strategic genius of commanders, about the power of industry, about mass heroism. But no one will write about how an engineering calculation, multiplied by a violation of instructions, broke the Wehrmacht's plans in a specific, separate swamp. No one, except these 340 people, who would go to sleep alive tonight. And for Sukhorokov, this arithmetic was enough. Absolutely enough. The war ended in May 1945. It left just as it came, to the rumble of tracks, but now this sound rang on the cobblestones of European capitals, not in Russian mud. Senior Sergeant Ivan Sukhorokov walked this path to the end. His war was a long road from the factory floor to the ruins of Berlin, a road measured not in kilometers, but in the number of restored transmissions and welded holes. Orders shone on his tunic. The Red Star, the Order of the Patriotic War, medals for courage and for combat merit. But the most important award wasn't on his chest. It was in something else. In the title, Honored Innovator,
which he received in peacetime, returning to his native Uralvagonzavad. This title wasn't given for beautiful eyes or loud speeches. It was given for brains, for that very engineering audacity that allowed solving insoluble tasks with makeshift means. Sukhorokov didn't become a general. He remained a master, a man whose hands always smelled of metal and machine oil. But his name entered the classified textbooks of tank schools and manuals on the operation of armored vehicles. Those very instructions that military prosecutors shoved in his face near Kursk were rewritten. The clause on the categorical prohibition of welding work on the undercarriage was supplemented by a note, a long, dry paragraph describing the technology of welding additional grousers in muddy conditions. It specified electrode grades, current strength, angles of inclination, and temperature regimes. What was born in a tent under pouring rain as an act of desperation became law. Engineering heresy turned into military dogma. The experience of the 145th Tank Regiment was studied in academies. Generals moving tokens on maps were forced to admit, maneuverability is not just engine power. It is traction. It is simple physics of interaction between track and ground. The Kursk bulge showed that even the most perfect tank is just an expensive pile of metal if it cannot push off the earth. And a simple steel angle iron, bought in peacetime for pennies in a hardware store, can be worth more than a tiger. After the war, military historians and engineers often argued about the reasons for victory. They talked about the mass production of the T-34, about sloped armor, about calibers. But they rarely remembered the people with gas cutters, about those who adapted technology to reality. The German engineering school created masterpieces of mechanics. Their tanks were like Swiss watches, precise, complex, requiring ideal maintenance. The Soviet school created construction-set tanks, rough but open to modernization with a sledgehammer and welding right in the field. Sukhorokov understood this better than anyone. He knew that war is a competition not only of factories, but also of minds. When a design bureau hit a dead end, a solution was found by a sergeant in an oily padded jacket. In the Armored Vehicle Museum in Kubinka stands one of these tanks. It is cleanly painted. Its armor shines under the light of spotlights. Guides tell schoolchildren about the feats of crews, about tactical and technical characteristics, about millimeters of armor penetration. Visitors look at the turret, at the gun barrel, but few lower their eyes. And if you lower your gaze and look closely at the tracks, you can see history. On one of the track links, if you scrape off the layer of museum paint, an old, rough weld seam is visible, a rusty scar on the body of the machine, a trace from that very 40 by 40 millimeter angle. The angle itself is gone. It was cut off or wore away on the roads of war, but the place of its attachment remained forever. It is not just a casting defect. It is the autograph of victory. This seam tells the story of how intellect defeated hopelessness. How in July 1943, Russian mechanics cancelled the laws of sliding. How 340 tankers returned home alive because their machines didn't become targets. Sukhorokov often came to the factory monument, a T-34 on a pedestal. He stood and smoked, looking at the frozen machine. He felt no pathos. He felt respect for metal and labor. He knew the price of this weapon. War is won not only by bravery. Bravery is a resource that burns out quickly under machine guns if it is not backed by material. War is won by calculation, logistics, and the ability to react instantly to changing conditions. War is dirty work, and the winner is the one who is not afraid to dirty his hands, reshaping factory instructions at the dictation of circumstances. The engineering ingenuity of Senior Sergeant Ivan Sukhorokov became as much a weapon as the F-34 cannon. A weapon that didn't shoot,
but allowed others to shoot. A weapon of the mind. And in this rusty trace of welding on a museum exhibit lies the entire philosophy of that war. It doesn't matter how perfect your equipment is. What matters is whether you can make it work when the world around turns into chaos and mud. Ivan Sukhurukov could, and his steel claws forever remained in the memory of metal, reminding that there are no hopeless situations. There is only a shortage of electrodes and imagination. History judged the dispute between physicists and lyricists, practitioners and theoreticians.
Steel welded to steel by the hand of a master won. The angle directed point down into the earth won. The man who knew that even 30 tons of dead weight can be made to fly if a fulcrum is applied correctly won.